I'm very excited today to introduce our speaker, Nina Silber, who's going to be talking about her new book published by Harvard Press called Daughters of the Union. It's a wonderful book. And Ms. Silber is Associate Professor of History at Boston University and has spoken here several times before at Old South. So please help me welcome her back. Here's Nina Silber. Thank you.
Thank you, Michelle. It is great to be here in Old South, and wonderful to think about, too, some of the women that I write about in this book and became familiar with in the course of doing research, who probably sat here, you know, in the years leading up to the Civil War, probably sat here for war meetings, wartime meeting gatherings, different events that would have taken place during the war, and would have experienced the war from these very seats. So it is very exciting to be here. There are certainly Boston women in this book that I've written. There are women from New England, and in fact the focus of this book is on women in the North, women from the northern states and how they experienced the Civil War. And to some people that might initially seem like an odd choice in writing about women in the war. Most northern women, except the few who lived in southwestern Pennsylvania, perhaps, were far removed from battlefields. Most of them, at least probably as we would imagine them, did not experience the hardships of war, the dislocations of war, certainly the way many southern women did. Perhaps we might even imagine that northern women were not hugely affected by the Civil War. And it's true, actually, as I did some of my research and I would come across a few letters and there would be a few women who would say, I feel that this war has not affected me that greatly in a way that I know it's affecting other people. So it has that kind of impression, I think, about northern women. But when I started to work on this, I didn't know if that was an accurate representation for northern women, if that really summed up their experiences or not, because I found that there was virtually nothing written on the subject of northern women and the Civil War. And that sort of struck me as odd, because here's the Civil War, which is written about from, I think, every possible angle imaginable. It's hard to imagine what angle has yet to be explored in writing about the Civil War, but practically nothing had been written on women in the northern states. And as I looked into this, I concluded that northern women, I think, have been the unfortunate victims of an ailment which I suppose we might as well call scarlet fever. Now, this ailment is not the typical childhood ailment, but it's really the problem of the images and the power of the images associated with Gone with the Wind, and how the images associated with Gone with the Wind, I think, really have crowded out for people any other ideas about women in the Civil War. And so I think, in fact, historians have this, but popular reading audiences as well. If they're not literally thinking about scarlet, their attention is on, well, you know, you think women in the war, you think plantation belles, you think lovely southern white women who had to go out to work in the fields, you think about genteel women who have to defend themselves against vicious Yankee invaders. And so it's that kind of image, I think, we have about wartime women. That problem, though, I think, of scarlet fever has meant that we've ignored or really not become aware of the different kinds of dramas and dislocations that women in the North experienced during the Civil War. And perhaps they were more subtle ones, but they were certainly significant. A second motivation I had in writing the book, not only the question of where were the northern women, but I also wanted to combat what I think tends to be a very unrealistic view that people sometimes have about women in wartime. And so now, I would say, if the problem was not the Scarlet syndrome, it was the Rosie the Riveter syndrome. Right, so which I think is the other kind of very common image, if not about the Civil War, but a sort of idea about women in wartime. In other words, this image says women in the time of war make great strides, they forge ahead, they go where women previously hadn't gone before, take on new jobs, new opportunities and occupations. And it's not to say that women in the Civil War did not do those things, but one of my goals here was not to reduce these women to a stereotype and not to turn them into an image of women that we might like to see, but to see a more complicated story that involved women coming to terms with different kinds of situations and coming to terms with a situation that was not always all that liberating, in fact, for women. So I would say a central theme that emerged in the course of my research and that comes across in the book that I wrote is that Northern women experienced the Civil War not as newly empowered feminists, but instead as very ambivalent, but in that sense also very human, historical actors. And so on the one hand, they took advantage of new opportunities that the war afforded. But on the other hand, what I found is that they learned in new and unexpected ways about the ways that women could feel circumscribed and powerless. So that's what I saw. I saw women who took over farms. I saw women who went to work in factories. I saw women who went to work in hospitals. I saw women who organized schools for freed slaves in the course of the war and stayed and taught the slaves after the war was over. I saw women who went to political rallies, women who delivered speeches. In fact, I would say the phrase new opportunities or new fields of activity does not really even fully convey the kinds of changes that Northern women experienced in the course of the war. In the book, I actually use the phrase, or the way I describe this, is to use this phrase, civic womanhood. And what I mean by that is that in the course of this war, women had a new sense of participating in national life. They had a new sense of obligation to the nation. They had a new sense of their identity as citizens in the nation. That idea of civic womanhood could be seen in expressions of women's commitment to the Union cause. It could be seen in the way they became tangled up with the federal bureaucracy, especially after there was a new pension system put in place. It could be seen in a very conscious policy on the part of the Republican Party to target women as their supporters, because they knew women could then influence their men to vote in a particular direction. And it could be seen in countless letters that women sent to Abraham Lincoln during the course of the war, such as the one that was written by Mary Herrick, who wrote, "I think a woman has all the rights of a free American citizen, and I want the American as it was without slavery." So there was that kind of new sense of civic awareness and civic obligation. Accompanying that, though, was also an awareness of second-class status. And so as women moved into new arenas, they moved into hospitals, they moved into political parties, as that happened, what I found is that women also experienced in new ways the power of men, and really kind of the dominant power of men, and the relative powerlessness of women. Let me tell you the story of one woman along these lines, and that's the experience of Julia Underhill. Julia Underhill lived in Kenosha, Wisconsin. She had a husband and 2 daughters when the Civil War began. Her father had disapproved of her marriage. I think she had married her school teacher, who was an older man, and her father disapproved of that, and he cut off all contact with Julia. He says, I have no more financial obligations to you. I'm not going to help you out anymore. So she's on her own. And by 1863, her husband, Lehman, had gone off. He was fighting in the war. She was on her own with her daughters in Wisconsin. And as a woman on her own in Kenosha, she also found herself subject to a new and a very unwanted kind of attention. "Every time I go out," she wrote to her husband, "there is a set of loafers." Actually, the word that she used in her letter was, she wrote it loafters, which I liked loafters because it sort of meant that maybe they were more actively loafing than just loafing. But so she that's the way she writes it. She says, "There's a set of loafters standing around that most eat up every woman with their eyes. There's no danger but what any soldier woman can get help as long as she tries to do what is right. But let her get a bad name, and decent folks won't help her." And so this sense of attention from men, the leers from strange men, and perhaps also this fear that a woman might get a bad name even if she didn't deserve a bad name, all of this, I think, affected Julia and made her feel like life on her own was not as easy as anybody might have thought it was. And eventually, in fact, it drove Julia to move to Massachusetts. She had relatives. She had 2 aunts who were living in Massachusetts. She heard that in Massachusetts women were being hired for good jobs as teachers, and so she decided that she would move. However, Julia was unable to get work in Massachusetts, at least as long as she presented herself as Julia Underhill. So she became Henry Goodwin. a teenage boy who soon after got work in an iron foundry. "I've got a good place to work," Julia wrote to her husband, "and am my employer's pet boy. It is the easiest way to support myself, and now I am free from insult." The work in the iron foundry, though, was very difficult. The conditions were certainly not conditions that Julia Underhill was used to working under. They sorely tested her constitution. And before Lehman returned to his wife and children, Julia Underhill died, still disguised as Henry Goodwin. And her true identity was revealed only when a local physician examined the body for cause of death. And so here was Julia Underhill, who certainly she lived, she died in a way that was not typical of most Northern women, but she experienced something of what I saw repeated in many other stories. That is a sense of hardship, a sense of feeling inadequate, inferior, that many Northern women felt. And so here she was. She tries to become self-sufficient. She tries to take on these new challenges. She tries to rise to the occasion which this war has presented her with. But like so many women, she found that she was pressed into these kinds of circumstances where her status as a woman left her feeling demeaned and financially desperate. Right? She couldn't get work as a woman. She had to actually be a boy in order to get work. And that theme especially of financial desperation, was emerging frequently in the letters that I read, in the stories that I read. That is, women didn't know, men would go off and they didn't know how much money was in the bank account. They didn't know how much their husband's pay was. They didn't know if they had made a contract with a worker to do some work on their farm, how much they usually paid that worker. They didn't know who they paid their mortgages to. They had virtually no conception of these kinds of financial situations and the financial reality that they lived with. And then this was compounded even more when men go off to war and they have their army pay, and they didn't send it back to the women. They didn't send it to their wives. Or if it was a son, they'd say, "I'm sending my money to the storekeeper. He has all my money, and if you need some money, go to him, and he'll give you something that, tell him what you need. But I want him to hold all the money." So this sense of kind of keeping women financially ignorant and really dependent on their husbands, dependent on other men, seemed to be perpetuated. All right. This, then, I think, was one very real side of the equation, that women were feeling that sense of inadequacy and even financial desperation. On the other side, there were women who did not fall victim to anyone's financial schemes or designs, and, in fact, women who triumphed under adverse circumstances. And one of the ways in which I saw this idea of civic womanhood at work was the way women became political actors. And they became political actors in a very subtle way, not by going out and casting a ballot, not by voting explicitly in election. They didn't have the right to vote. But they became political actors because they said, okay, the men are not here, and somebody has to inform them of the political situation on the home front. Right? And especially, if they were Republicans and they felt that, most of the Republicans, the people who supported the Republican Party and the party of Lincoln, were off at the war, and who was left at home? It was the Democrats. Well, the women had felt very strongly that they had to kind of become a political presence. They had to write back and they had to tell their husbands, who was a Democrat, who was voting what way, who felt what about this issue, who was winning in the elections. And they would even, debate their neighbors, they would challenge their neighbors, and even organize themselves in what we would have to say were political rallies and political events to exert a political influence. And so here, another story I think was very telling, and that was the story of Anne Cotton. Anne Cotton, her husband Josiah was a surgeon who served with an Ohio regiment during the war. While Josiah was at the war, Anne remained at home. She had her 3 children. She seemed also at various points to have friends and relatives who assisted her around the home. She, while her husband was away, expressed profound remorse early on during her husband's absence. So after hearing about the difficult fighting that was taking place around Vicksburg, Mississippi, knowing that her husband was somewhere around there, she wrote down in a letter, she explained her anxiety. She said, "I am more a wife than a patriot, And although I do care for my country, I care for you much more. Now, this was not that unusual to read in a wartime letter. It's not that unusual to read in any wartime letter, regardless of what the war is. And Anne, I think, faced conflicts and tensions that many Northern women felt. How could they sacrifice for a country? How could they place the demands of the country and the nation above their own needs for their family and to feel that their family was safe? But reading those letters, as well as the similar kinds of letters, but from a different angle, that men wrote to women, it also made me realize that that conflict, that sense of how do I sacrifice home for nation, or can I, put the needs of the home below the needs of the nation, that kind of conflict, it occurred to me that it was a conflict that Northern women, Union women in the North, felt even more acutely and more self-consciously than Southern women. Because the way I read it, and the way it seemed to me it always came across in the letters, in the Confederacy, the cause itself was depicted as a struggle for the home, for the hearth. And it was not difficult to say, we're defending our country, and at the same time that we're defending our country, we're defending our homes. That those two things could come together in a kind of defense of the home against the Yankee invader, and so we're defending our country and our home at the same time. And Confederates could meld those two things in a way that the Union soldiers could not. And so in the North, with the soldiers fighting for this more abstract cause of the Union, with men going off to fight in a faraway place, not standing right there fending off the enemy, it became much more difficult to link that fight for the nation with the fight for the home. And in fact, unlike the Confederate soldiers, the Union soldiers would often rank their commitments, right? They'd say, I'm fighting for my country first, I'm fighting for my home and family second, and they would be explicit about making those kinds of priorities. If you remember in the Ken Burns Civil War documentary, in his very famous letter by Sullivan Ballou, which was very prominent in that documentary series, his letter is precisely one of these kind of, I have to rank my commitments right now in this time of war. He writes about how much he loves his wife. He has this undying love for his wife. But then he says that, quote, a love of country comes over me like a strong wind and bears me irresistibly to the battlefield. There was that kind of ranking of commitments. Another soldier put that same idea far less poetically. He said, first my God, second, my country. Third, my mother. Now, you wouldn't want to be, I wouldn't want to have been that guy's mother. That's not reading that particular letter. But what's interesting about that is that it forced men to grapple with a struggle that stood outside the home. And not only did it force the men to grapple with that, but it forced women to grapple with that kind of struggle too. And while I think a lot of women had trouble accepting that that was a priority, country comes first and then the home, I think some of the women began to recognize that even they were making a sacrifice for something more abstract. And that when they, said to men, okay, go off and fight in this war, they understood that there was a separation of those priorities and that there was a struggle for nationhood, a struggle for something more abstract in this idea of union, and it was not just a struggle about the immediate home and family. And over time, that idea of sacrificing for the nation, that idea began to have an effect even on women like Anne Cotton. So she began to follow the war news more carefully. She began to form opinions about the merits of various generals. She began to meet with other women in her community. They would talk about the war. They would send supplies to the soldiers. She would give her husband, as I was saying before, she would give him very careful and detailed reports on local politics. So-and-so is now voting Democratic. So-and-so is not voting Democratic. I think the Democrats are becoming more influential in this town than they used to be. And she would give him sort of constant political updates. And most importantly, she joined with other local women to hold a festival in support of Ohio's Republican governor. which I think was a very important political gesture in a state where the Republican Party, where the party of Lincoln, faced very serious challenges to hold on to political office in the middle years of the war. So with other women, she sort of said, well, we're a political force to be reckoned with, too. We've identified our commitment with the Republican Party, and that, in turn, will affect how men vote, will influence the way men vote on party politics. And so as the war goes on, Ann Cotton, I think, still yearns desperately for her husband's return, but she also came to identify his sacrifice and her own sacrifice of him with this kind of larger civic enterprise of fighting for the nation. Finally, some of the women who probably experienced the most dramatic changes during the course of the Civil War were those women who became nurses. And there were thousands, more so actually in the Union than in the Confederacy, but thousands of women who enlisted as nurses, who found various ways to join the ranks of the nursing corps. Many of them had been inspired by the work of Florence Nightingale during the Crimean War. And so thousands of these women looked for various ways that they could provide medical attention to sick and injured Union soldiers. Whether or not they had a lot of previous experience or not, they would apply to do this work. And in fact, the Civil War years were very critical as a point for women to enter the nursing profession. It encouraged them to see themselves in this new profession of nursing. It encouraged them to demand greater training in this profession after the war was over. It encouraged them to demand greater professional recognition and to sort of for the country to acknowledge this important contribution that women had made. So I want to conclude with the story of one of these women who became a nurse in the course of the Civil War, and that was Cornelia Hancock. Cornelia Hancock was born in a small village in New Jersey in 1840. She was 23 when she decided to become a nurse. This was right after the Battle of Gettysburg. Now, there were different routes that women could take in order to become a nurse during the Civil War, but one was to go through the officially appointed superintendent of female nurses, and that was a well-known Massachusetts reformer, a woman by the name of Dorothea Dix. Cornelia Hancock first tried to become a nurse by going to Dix, but Dix had very strict requirements about who could and couldn't be a nurse, and if you were too young, that is, if you were under 30, you could not be a nurse. And according to Dix, you also could not be too attractive. As she put it in her directives, she would only hire plain-looking women. So you got to sort of wonder, if you were hired by Dix, was that a good thing or a bad thing? But in any case, for Cornelia Hancock, it was not an issue because she was too young. Perhaps she was also too attractive, and so she was not hired by Dorothea Dix. But she went to Gettysburg on her own, which is actually what quite a number of women did. They just said, okay, well, I don't have to attach myself to this official nursing corps. And if they knew somebody, and in Cornelia's in her case, actually, her brother-in-law was a physician. So that sort of provides her with an opening. She can go, she can accompany him, and kind of doesn't need any kind of official appointment from the nursing corps in order to do this. So she goes. She goes with her brother-in-law and went to Gettysburg and proved herself extremely capable and resourceful. Many people, in fact, called her, I don't know if this was their phrase or her phrase, but she was called the shiftiest woman on the ground. So she figured out how to get around the Army bureaucracy because a lot of times they would say, no, we would only give this much beef to our patients. And she said, these guys are starving, and they're desperate for more food, and there's not enough variety in their diet. And she would find ways to get around the Army bureaucracy to get them better diets, get them better supplies, get them better fed. After her experience in Gettysburg, she stayed with her sister and her brother-in-law for a while in Philadelphia, but then soon after that went right back to the front and attended to thousands of men who were suffering from wounds and illnesses during the horrible Virginia campaigns in 1864, when Grant was fighting Lee in Virginia in that last year before the war ended, where the casualty rate was astronomical. In the fall of 1864, Cornelia Hancock was chosen by the men to make an appeal. They asked her specifically to go and make an appeal to Ulysses Grant himself on behalf of a soldier who wished to get a furlough right after his wife had died. No military man Hancock explained, could go, because it was informal and would not be granted. Hancock's appeal, however, succeeded in convincing Grant and getting the furlough, which was placed in the soldiers' hands within 2 hours' time of her interview. "My fame," she wrote to her mother after this happened, "has spread the length and breadth of this camp, such a miracle accomplished in so short a time." So she was incredibly resourceful that way and knew how to work the Army bureaucracy to get things that patients needed. And I think if we told no more about her story, she would be sort of, one of these rise as a kind of woman of great honor and distinction. We could put her in the honor roll of women's history, right? She's plucky, she's determined, she's very capable. She's going to defy the bureaucracy and accomplish things that men could not. And I don't have any intention of erasing those accomplishments because they were real, they were genuine, and her contribution was significant. But what I do find is that her story becomes complicated. And it becomes complicated when you look at the way Cornelia Hancock understood and interpreted for herself what the Civil War was about and what she was doing in the Civil War. So she would write, aside from all of these accomplishments of hers, she would write repeatedly of, the all-powerful knowledge of the surgeons, that they knew everything, they knew best. She would write about how much she resented other women who tried to supervise in the Army hospital. She said, women have no business being here, they have no sense of leadership, people won't listen to women. And she writes, too, about a kind of general alienation she has from the political issues of the war. She says, I'm just a foot soldier, and, the real decisions are being made by generals, by political leaders. I just, take marching orders. And ultimately, in fact, she did not even believe that she would rank herself as high as one of those foot soldiers, since she said, well, the soldiers are really doing the most important work in this war. They're out there fighting, they're doing the military work, and that's the most important thing, and I, can't even measure up to that. And she says, in fact, at one point, God bless them, I say, when I see a soldier faithfully plodding through the dust protecting me. I feel more insignificant than words can express. And that, seemed like a very powerful and sort of disturbing thing to say. Because here she was shifty, she was resourceful, she was in her own way powerful in the way that she worked through the Army bureaucracy, but she also felt weak and insignificant when she said, here's what I'm doing, here's what everybody else is doing, here's what the soldiers are doing, and my work just pales completely in significance. And I saw that sense of insignificance, that sense of diminishment in many women's writings. And I couldn't help but wonder how that went on to influence women in the years after the war, how mingled with these feelings of a sense of pride, a sense of accomplishment, there was also this feeling that they continued to have a subordinate position, even a demeaned position, that there was practically nothing that they could do to escape that sense of subordination. And so, in the end, I would say this is not a story of women's unmitigated triumph in a time of war, but I do think it's a story that is a more realistic description of how change occurs, how people experience changes, and that it happens in halting ways, in tentative ways, with a few steps forward, with a few simultaneous steps backward. And so a simplistic historical account might say that, okay, here we have Northern women participating in the Civil War as nurses and doing all this political activity, and there's just a kind of straight line that goes from that to the suffrage movement of the late 19th and early 20th century. But I don't think there is a straight line. I don't think there's any straight line from Northern women and the Civil War to the early 20th century women's movement and that campaign for women's suffrage. I would say that there's probably a crooked line, a twisting line, a line that brought with it the triumphs, especially the memories of triumphs of wartime independence, but also a sober assessment of the many different ways in which women continued to be second-class citizens in the American Republic. Thank you.
We can take some questions, and I'm just going to pass around the microphone because we are filming for the WGBH Forum Network. So if you would like the mic, just raise your hand, and I'll bring it right to you.
Based on what you said, what about Boston women? How do they fit into this, or Eastern Massachusetts? More of the same, a little different?
Well, a lot would depend on. I guess I would have to say a lot would depend on their social class. So certainly, a big factor here is those women whose husbands and male relatives found ways out of the war, didn't actually go and fight themselves. Maybe, you could buy a substitute. There were different ways in which you didn't have to participate. And those women who did have male relatives who served. So that certainly is a big point of distinction. So it's interesting. Some of the women, there was a small group of women's letters and diaries I read from, fairly well-to-do women in Brookline, and it was in their writings that I remember specifically coming across phrases where they felt, I know there's this horrific war going on, so why, I don't feel like I'm very much affected by that. But I would say that was drastically different. There are accounts of, a group of poor, working-class women in Boston soon after the war started, who are hanging around the Common, who are, trying to appeal to government officials because they need some kind of. When the war started, there was not an automatic system in place that would give women some kind of money, to compensate for the relatives who were away. So, there were women who were sort of desperately out looking for some kind of financial assistance and financial help. So a lot of that, I think, did vary along class lines. And I would say, then, of course, the tradition of abolitionism was also another factor here. And so, there are quite a significant number of women in the Boston area and around New England who feel a different kind of commitment and activism in the course of the war because they have this tradition of activism with the abolitionist movement. And so they follow sort of the news of the war, the activities of the war, much more closely.
After the war ended, I assume in many cases letters ended as spouses came home, as women returned to families. But were you able to trace the lives of any of these women after the war, like Hancock or Cotton?
A little bit, but you're right. That's the thing about the war is it produces this incredible, and even diaries, I notice a dramatic difference between how much they write in diaries in the course of the war, and even if they continue to keep a diary afterwards, it falls off significantly. And certainly you do find that a lot of the women who became nurses, who, were active in those ways, continued to be active. That was certainly true, that they were either, they continued in the health profession, they participated in other kinds of reform work. There was also, a not insignificant group of women who joined veterans, there was the organization that male veterans joined, and then women's auxiliaries that would go along with that. And actually a very sizable, I think one of the largest women's organizations in the post-war period was a group called the Women's Relief Corps, which was the women's auxiliary to the Grand Army of the Republic. And women, were very active participants in that. And they would go, they would go to these meetings, they would organize Memorial Day events, how should we recognize the soldiers? They would write their own accounts about what happened in the war. And were very active. I think one of the things they were most active in is financial assistance to widows and orphans, and also at one point then became very active in a campaign to get pensions, not just for the soldiers had their pensions, but for the nurses. And by the end of in the 1890s, I think at one point they actually were successful in getting a pension system in place for the women who were nurses.
All right, I want to thank Professor Silber for speaking to us here today, and to let everyone know again, we do have copies of this wonderful book for sale, so if you would like a copy, you can certainly see Nancy in the back corner over there, and Professor Silber will be signing. So thank you all for coming today, and enjoy the rest of your afternoon.
Thank you.